Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make your history teacher blush and your grandmother clutch her pearls. We're diving deep into the shadowy corners of ancient Rome, where marble columns cast long shadows and the night economy thrived in ways that would make modern Las Vegas look like a church social. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the height of the Roman Empire, around 100 CE. The sun has just set over the Seven Hills, casting the bustling streets of Rome into a golden twilight that slowly fades to purple, then black. But while respectable citizens are settling in for the evening, another world is just waking up. A world where oil lamps flicker in narrow alleyways, where wine flows freely, and where the night holds secrets that historians have whispered about for centuries, but rarely discussed in polite company. You see, when we think of ancient Rome, we usually picture gladiators in the Colosseum, senators in togas debating in the Forum, or perhaps Caesar crossing the Rubicon. But there's an entire side of Roman life that existed in the shadows, literally and figuratively. A nocturnal economy that was as integral to Roman society as the aqueducts that brought water to the city or the roads that connected the empire. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on what really happened when the sun went down in the Eternal City. Now, I need to be clear about something from the start. What we're about to explore isn't just salacious gossip or historical tabloid material. This is serious social history. The night economy of ancient Rome reveals fundamental truths about power, class, gender, and survival in one of history's most influential civilizations. It shows us how ordinary people navigated a world of extreme inequality, how women found agency in a patriarchal society, and how the most marginalized members of Roman society carved out spaces for themselves in the cracks of empire. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The Romans didn't hide this world away in shame. They integrated it into their daily lives, their literature, their art, and even their religious practices in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. What happened in the Roman night wasn't a dirty secret whispered about in corners. It was part of the fabric of civilization itself. The women we're going to meet tonight weren't just victims of circumstance, though many certainly were. They were entrepreneurs, artists, confidants, and power brokers who navigated one of the most complex social hierarchies in human history. Some were slaves with no choice in their fate. Others were freed women who built small empires in the shadows. A few even became an culture. They're wealthy enough to influence politics. Stories reveal a side of Roman life that's been sanitized out of most history books, but is absolutely essential to understanding how the ancient world really worked. And before we go any further, let me address the elephant in the room. Yes, we're going to be talking about sex work in ancient Rome, but we're not going to sensationalize it or treat it like some kind of historical peep show. What these women did was work. Hard, dangerous, often degrading work that was nevertheless essential to the functioning of Roman society. They deserve our respect, not our judgment, and their stories deserve to be told with the same seriousness we'd give to any other aspect of ancient history. So, what exactly are we going to discover tonight? We're going to walk through the streets of ancient Rome after dark and see what really happened when the sun went down. We'll visit the taverns where wine flowed and deals were made, the bathhouses where business was conducted in steamy alcoves, and yes, the brothels where some of the most marginalized members of society fought for survival and dignity in a world that offered them precious little of either. But more than that, we're going to meet the women themselves. We'll learn about their daily routines, their survival strategies, their relationships with clients and each other, and the complex web of laws, customs, and social expectations that govern their lives. We'll discover how some managed to accumulate wealth and influence despite their low legal status, and how others used their positions to gather intelligence that could topple senators or make emperors. We'll also explore the clients, because understanding this world means understanding all the players. From lonely soldiers far from home to wealthy merchants seeking entertainment, from young men getting their first taste of adult life to married senators looking for excitement their wives couldn't provide. The demand side of this equation tells us just as much about Roman society as the supply side. And here's something that might surprise you. The Roman night economy wasn't just about individual transactions between desperate women and lustful men. It was a complex ecosystem that included tavern keepers, musicians, dancers, bathhouse attendants, bodyguards, moneylenders, and even priests. It had its own neighborhoods, its own customs, its own hierarchies of status and respect. It was, in many ways, a parallel society that operated alongside the official Roman world we read about in history books. Now, you might be wondering how we know so much about a world that existed in the shadows 2,000 years ago. The answer is that the Romans were prolific writers and record keepers, and they wrote about everything. We have legal documents, tax records, graffiti, poetry, plays, novels, and even personal letters that give us intimate glimpses into this hidden world. The walls of Pompeii alone preserve hundreds of inscriptions that reveal the names, prices, and specialties of individual sex workers. Ancient authors like Martial, Juvenal, and Petronius wrote extensively about the night economy, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disgust, but always with the kind of detail that makes historians weep with joy. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. The Roman approach to sex work was fundamentally different from our modern attitudes. It wasn't driven by the same moral frameworks that shape contemporary debates. The Romans were concerned with social order, legal status, and maintaining clear hierarchies, but they weren't particularly hung up on sexual morality in the way we might expect. This created a world where sex work was simultaneously legal and stigmatized, profitable and dangerous, socially necessary and morally questionable. The women who worked in this world had to navigate these contradictions every single night. They had to understand the complex laws that governed their behavior, the social codes that determined how they could interact with different classes of clients, and the unwritten rules that meant the difference between survival and disaster. They developed their own forms of solidarity, their own methods of protection, and their own ways of finding dignity in a world that officially denied them any. And the clients? They came from every level of Roman society, but they all had to leave their official identities at the door when they entered this world. A senator and a slave might find themselves drinking wine at the same tavern, listening to the same musicians, and competing for the attention of the same women. The night economy was one of the few places in Roman society where social hierarchies became fluid, where money mattered more than birth, and where a clever woman could accumulate more real power than many respectable matrons. But perhaps most importantly, this world reveals the human side of ancient Rome. Behind all the marble statues and grand political narratives were real people trying to make their way in a harsh and unforgiving world. Some of the most touching documents we have from ancient Rome are the personal letters and tomb inscriptions that reveal genuine affection between sex workers and their clients, friendships that lasted decades, and small acts of kindness that made brutal lives bearable. So tonight, we're going to step into their world. We're going to walk the streets they walked, visit the places they worked, and try to understand their lives on their own terms. We're going to discover what Roman prostitutes actually did all night, but we're also going to discover what it meant to be human in one of history's most complex societies. We'll start in the taverns, those smoky, wine-soaked establishments that served as the nerve centers of Roman nightlife. These weren't just places to drink. They were social clubs, business centers, and entertainment venues all rolled into one. The women who worked in taverns weren't necessarily prostitutes in the narrow sense, But the line between serving wine and providing other services was often deliberately blurred. These establishments operated under a complex set of legal and social rules that governed everything from the price of wine to the behavior of patrons. And understanding them is crucial to understanding the broader world of Roman night work. From there, we'll move to the bathhouses, those magnificent temples, to cleanliness and relaxation that were among Rome's greatest innovations. But after dark, the baths became something else entirely. The warm, steamy rooms and private alcoves provided perfect settings for intimate encounters, and the women who worked there developed sophisticated methods for attracting and serving clients while avoiding the attention of authorities. The bathhouse scene reveals how deeply integrated sex work was into everyday Roman life. Then we'll venture into the brothels themselves, from the grand lupanars that catered to wealthy clients to the tiny cubicles where the poorest women served the desperate and dispossessed. We'll learn about the daily routines of the women who worked there, the prices they charged, the services they offered, and the strategies they used to survive in what was often a brutal and dangerous environment. But we won't stop there. We'll also explore the world of the higher class courtesans, the educated and sophisticated women who commanded enormous fees and wielded considerable influence. These women were poets, musicians, and conversationalists who provided intellectual companionship as much as physical pleasure. Some became wealthy enough to own property, sponsor gladiators, and even influence political decisions. Their stories reveal the possibilities and limitations faced by women in Roman society, and they challenge our assumptions about agency and empowerment in the ancient world. Throughout this journey, we'll be guided by the voices of the women themselves, preserved in graffiti, letters, and legal documents. We'll hear their jokes, their complaints, their boasts, and their dreams. We'll learn about their relationships with each other, their strategies for dealing with difficult clients, and their hopes for the future. These voices, speaking across 2 millennia, remind us that history isn't just about kings and conquests, but about ordinary people living extraordinary lives in impossible circumstances. So are you ready to step into the shadows of ancient Rome? Ready to discover a world where survival required cunning, where dignity was a luxury few could afford, and where human connection flourished in the most unlikely places? Ready to meet the women who turned the Roman night into their domain and carved out spaces for themselves in the margins of empire? Then let's begin our journey into the Roman night, where the real story of the world's greatest empire was written not in marble and bronze, but in wine stains and whispered secrets, in fleeting encounters and lasting friendships, in the quiet courage of women who refused to disappear even when the world tried to erase them. The taverns are calling, the oil lamps are flickering to life, and somewhere in the distance we can hear the sound of laughter and music drifting through the narrow streets. The Roman night is about to begin, and we're about to discover what really happened when the sun went down in the Eternal City. The first stop on our nocturnal journey takes us to the heart of Roman nightlife, the taverns. But forget everything you think you know about ancient drinking establishments. These weren't quaint little pubs with wooden signs and friendly barkeeps. Roman taverns were complex social ecosystems, where wine was just the beginning of what was on offer. Picture stepping through the heavy wooden door of a typical Roman tavern around the second hour after sunset. The air hits you immediately, thick with the smell of cheap wine, cooking oil, and unwashed bodies pressed together in the flickering lamplight. The noise is overwhelming, a cacophony of conversations in a dozen different languages. The clink of ceramic cups, dice rattling on wooden tables, and somewhere in the back, a flute player whose melody weaves through the chaos like smoke. But it's the women that catch your attention. They move through the crowd with practiced ease, balancing jugs of wine on their hips, leaning in close to whisper in customers' ears, laughing at jokes that probably aren't funny but keep the coins flowing. These are the barmaids, the serving girls, the tavern women, whose official job was to pour wine, but whose real work was far more complex. The Romans called them coppi, and they occupied a fascinating grey area in the social hierarchy. Technically, they were just servers, but everyone understood the unspoken rules. A barmaid who lingered too long at a table, who laughed too readily at a customer's stories, who accepted gifts beyond the standard tip, was crossing invisible lines that everyone pretended not to see. The tavern owners encouraged this ambiguity because it kept customers coming back and spending more. The women navigated it because it meant the difference between survival and starvation. Take Fortunata, whose name we know from a wine cup found in the ruins of a Pompeii tavern. The inscription reads, "Fortunata gives sweet wine and sweeter kisses." Was she just a clever barmaid with a talent for marketing? Or was she advertising services beyond wine pouring? The beautiful ambiguity of that inscription tells us everything we need to know about how these establishments really operated. The tavern women developed intricate strategies for managing their dual roles. They had to be friendly enough to encourage spending, but not so forward as to attract unwanted attention from authorities. They had to judge each customer quickly, determining who had money to spend, who might cause trouble, and who might be looking for more than just wine. A successful tavern woman was part actress, part psychologist, part accountant. But the taverns weren't just about individual transactions between women and customers. They were community centres for Rome's night people. Regular customers developed relationships with specific women that could last for years. We have graffiti from Pompeii where customers boast about their favourite barmaids, sometimes even declaring their love. "I love successus," reads one wall. "May whoever erases this get sick." Another proclaims, "Restituta has enslaved many men with her beauty." These relationships weren't always transactional. Sometimes they were genuinely affectionate. The tavern women often knew their regular customers better than their own wives did. They listened to complaints about work, family troubles, political frustrations. They celebrated victories and commiserated over defeats. In a society where emotional intimacy between men and women was often constrained by rigid social roles, the taverns provided a space where these barriers could temporarily dissolve. The economic arrangements were equally complex. Tavern women weren't typically employees in our modern sense. Many were slaves owned by the tavern keeper, who took a cut of everything they earned. Others were freed women who rented space and paid a percentage to the owner. A few successful women eventually saved enough to buy their own establishments, becoming tavern keepers themselves and employing other women. The prices varied wildly depending on the establishment, the woman, and the services provided. A cup of ordinary wine might cost an as, about the same as a loaf of bread. But wine served by an attractive woman who lingered to chat might cost 3 times as much. And if that conversation led to other activities, well, the sky was the limit. The legal situation was deliberately murky. Roman law recognized that tavern women often provided sexual services, but it didn't explicitly regulate this activity. Instead, it focused on maintaining public order and ensuring that taxes were paid. Tavern keepers were required to register their establishments and pay licensing fees, but what happened inside was largely left to local customs and individual negotiations. This legal ambiguity created opportunities, but also vulnerabilities. A tavern woman could accumulate wealth and even social standing if she was clever and lucky, but she could also be exploited, abused, or discarded without legal recourse. The successful ones learned to build networks of protection, cultivating relationships with powerful customers who would intervene on their behalf if necessary. The taverns also served as information exchanges. Merchants shared news from distant provinces, soldiers gossiped about military campaigns, and politicians tested public opinion on controversial policies. The women who worked there were perfectly positioned to overhear conversations that could be valuable to the right buyers. Some tavern women became informal intelligence agents, selling information to anyone willing to pay. But perhaps most importantly, the taverns provided something that was rare in Roman society, a space where social boundaries became fluid. A wealthy merchant might find himself sharing a table with a common labourer, both competing for the attention of the same woman. Money mattered more than birth, wit more than status. For a few hours, the rigid hierarchies that defined Roman life could be temporarily suspended. The women understood this dynamic and used it to their advantage. They became experts at reading social cues, at understanding which customers could be pushed for higher tips, and which needed to be handled with delicacy. They learned to speak multiple languages, to discuss politics and philosophy, to sing popular songs and tell entertaining stories. The most successful tavern women were Renaissance figures avant la lettre, combining beauty, intelligence, and business acumen in ways that would have been impossible in more respectable occupations. As the night wore on and the wine flowed more freely, the atmosphere in the taverns would become increasingly charged. Dice games grew more heated, conversations became more intimate, and the line between socializing and soliciting became even blurrier. Some customers would settle their tabs and head home to respectable beds. Others would negotiate for private time with their favorite server, disappearing into back rooms or upstairs chambers that every tavern seemed to have, but no one officially acknowledged. The women who worked these late shifts faced additional challenges. Drunken customers were unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes violent. Local authorities occasionally conducted raids, though these were often more about collecting bribes than enforcing morality. And as dawn approached, there was always the question of whether the night's earnings would be enough to make the risks worthwhile. But here's what made the Roman tavern scene truly remarkable. Despite all the exploitation, all the danger, all the social stigma, many of these women created genuine communities. They looked out for each other, shared information about difficult customers, and pooled resources when one of their number faced trouble. They developed their own hierarchies of respect, their own codes of conduct, their own forms of mutual support. We see evidence of these relationships in the archaeological record. Tomb inscriptions reveal tavern women who were mourned by colleagues, who left money to support friends in old age, who were remembered not just as workers, but as beloved companions. These weren't just business relationships, but genuine bonds forged in the crucible of shared experience. The tavern women also influenced Roman culture in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. They were among the first to sing new songs, to spread new fashions, to adopt new slang. They served as cultural bridges between different social classes and ethnic groups. A Syrian merchant might teach a tavern woman a song from his homeland, which she would then sing for Roman customers, gradually introducing foreign melodies into local culture. Some tavern women even achieved a kind of celebrity status. Their names would be scratched on walls across the city, their beauty celebrated in poems, their wit quoted in literary circles. These women understood that fame, even of the most precarious kind, could be converted into economic advantage and social protection. As we prepare to leave the taverns and continue our journey through the Roman night, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned. The tavern women of ancient Rome were far more than passive victims of male exploitation. They were active agents in their own lives, using whatever tools they had available to navigate a harsh and unforgiving world. They created spaces of intimacy and connection in a society that often seemed designed to prevent both. They built businesses, forged relationships, and left their mark on one of history's greatest civilizations. But the taverns were just the beginning of our story. As the night deepened and the wine flowed more freely, many customers would move on to other establishments, other pleasures, other encounters with the women who made the Roman night their domain. The bathhouses are calling, with their warm waters and steamy alcoves, their own complex hierarchies and unwritten rules. The Roman night is far from over, and we're just getting started on our journey into a world where survival required courage, where dignity was a daily struggle, and where human connection bloomed in the most unlikely places. The tavern women have shown us one face of this hidden economy, but there are many more stories waiting to be told, many more voices waiting to be heard from the shadows of the eternal city. So let's follow those same customers as they stumble out of the taverns, wine heavy on their breath and coins still jingling in their purses. The night is far from over, and Rome's most ingenious innovation awaits them just around the corner: the baths. Now, when most people think of Roman baths, they picture gleaming marble, pristine pools, and civilized Romans discussing philosophy while soaking in mineral waters. And yes, during the day, that's exactly what they were. But after dark, the baths transformed into something entirely different, something the history books rarely mention, but the Romans themselves understood perfectly well. The great public baths closed at sunset, but that didn't mean the waters stopped flowing. Smaller private bathhouses operated throughout the night, and these weren't just about getting clean, they were about getting intimate. The combination of warm water, dim lighting, and naked bodies created an atmosphere that was, shall we say, conducive to activities that went far beyond personal hygiene. The women who worked the night baths were different from the tavern girls we just met. They were called balneae, and they occupied their own unique niche in Rome's sexual economy. Some were officially employed as bath attendants, responsible for maintaining the waters, providing towels, and offering massages. Others were freelancers who rented space and services from the bathhouse owners. All of them understood that their real job was to make sure customers left feeling very, very relaxed. The architecture of these establishments was designed with discretion in mind. Multiple pools of varying temperatures, private alcoves tucked behind marble columns, and massage rooms with heavy curtains that could be drawn for privacy. The sound of flowing water masked conversations and other activities, while the steam created a hazy, dreamlike atmosphere where anything seemed possible. But here's where it gets really interesting. The bathhouses weren't just about quick transactions. They were social spaces where relationships could develop over time. A wealthy merchant might become a regular, always requesting the same attendant, always booking the same private room. These arrangements could last for months, or even years, blurring the line between commercial transaction and genuine companionship. The women developed elaborate rituals around the bathing experience. They would greet regular customers with warm towels and knowing smiles, guide them through the different temperature pools, and provide massages that started innocently enough, but could evolve into whatever the customer was willing to pay for. The most skilled bath attendants were part therapist, part masseuse, part confidant. Take Claudia, whose name appears in several Pompeii graffiti inscriptions. Claudia has magic hands, reads one wall. She can wash away any man's troubles. Another, more explicit, Claudia knows what you need before you ask. These weren't just advertisements. They were testimonials from satisfied customers who felt compelled to share their experiences with the world. The economic arrangements in the bathhouses were more complex than in the taverns. Bath attendants typically kept a larger percentage of their earnings because their services commanded higher prices. A basic massage might cost the same as a good meal, but specialized services could cost 10 times as much. The most popular women could afford to be selective about their clients, turning away customers who seemed drunk, violent, or unable to pay. The clientele was different too. While taverns attracted men from all social classes, the bathhouses drew a more upscale crowd. Merchants, middle-ranking officials, successful craftsmen, even the occasional senator slumming it away from his usual haunts. These men had money to spend and reputations to protect, which made them generally easier to deal with than the rougher tavern crowd. But the bathhouses also presented unique challenges. The combination of nudity, warm water, and alcohol could make customers unpredictable. Women had to be constantly alert for signs that a relaxing massage was about to turn into something more aggressive. The successful bath attendants developed sixth sense about reading their clients' moods and knowing when to call for help. The help usually came in the form of the bathhouse's security staff, typically ex-gladiators or former soldiers who were paid to keep order. These men understood that their job wasn't just to break up fights, but to protect the women who generated the establishment's profits. A reputation for safety was essential for attracting and keeping both customers and workers. The legal status of bathhouse activities was even murkier than tavern work. Roman law acknowledged that bath attendants provided personal services, but avoided getting too specific about what those services entailed. Local magistrates were supposed to regulate the establishments, but enforcement was sporadic and often more about collecting bribes than maintaining moral standards. This legal grey area created opportunities for corruption at every level. Bathhouse owners paid officials to look the other way. Wealthy customers expected their privacy to be protected. Women paid for the right to work in the better establishments. Everyone had their hand out, and everyone had something to hide. But within this web of corruption and exploitation, genuine human connections still flourished. The warm, intimate environment of the bathhouses fostered relationships that could transcend the purely commercial. Regular customers would ask about their favorite attendant's health, bring gifts from their travels, even provide financial support during difficult times. Some of these relationships evolved into something approaching marriage, though legal marriage between citizens and sex workers was impossible. Instead, couples would form partnerships that everyone understood but no one officially acknowledged. The woman would continue working but might limit her services to her partner. The man would provide financial support and protection while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a regular customer. The bath attendants also formed their own communities within the establishments. Senior women mentored newcomers, teaching them the subtle arts of reading customers, managing difficult situations and maximizing earnings. They shared information about dangerous clients, pooled resources to help colleagues in trouble, and celebrated each other's successes. The most successful bath attendants could eventually buy their way out of the business. They might purchase their own small bathhouse, invest in other businesses, or simply retire to a modest but comfortable life. A few exceptional women accumulated enough wealth to become significant property owners, though they had to be careful not to attract too much attention from jealous competitors or greedy officials. The bathhouses also served as informal information networks. Wealthy customers would discuss business deals, political developments, and personal scandals while relaxing in the warm waters. The women who served them were perfectly positioned to overhear valuable intelligence, which could then be sold to interested parties or used for their own advantage. Some bath attendants became unofficial counselors to their regular customers. Men who couldn't discuss their problems with their wives or colleagues would open up to women they trusted, seeking advice about everything from business decisions to family troubles. The attendants who developed reputations for wisdom and discretion could command premium prices for their counsel as much as their physical services. As the night progressed and the wine from earlier tavern visits began to wear off, many customers would find themselves having deeper, more meaningful conversations with the women attending them. The combination of physical relaxation and emotional intimacy created a unique space where Roman men could temporarily shed their public personas and reveal their private selves. But not every encounter ended in profound connection. The bathhouses also catered to customers who simply wanted efficient, anonymous service. These men would arrive, conduct their business quickly, and leave without much conversation. The women who worked there had to be equally adept at providing warm companionship or cool professionalism, depending on what each situation required. The variety of services available in the bathhouses was remarkable. Beyond the obvious, women offered everything from hairstyling to fortune-telling, from language lessons to political gossip. Some specialized in particular techniques or catered to specific fetishes. Others built their reputations on their ability to provide whatever their customers needed. both physically and emotionally. The most exclusive bathhouses employed women who were essentially courtesans, educated and sophisticated companions who could discuss literature, philosophy, and current events as easily as they could provide more intimate services. These women commanded enormous fees and served only the wealthiest customers, but they also enjoyed a level of respect and autonomy that was rare in the sex trade. As dawn approached and the night's activities wound down, the bath attendants would begin their own cleaning rituals. They would wash away the traces of the night's work, tend to any injuries or bruises acquired during difficult encounters, and count their earnings while sharing stories about particularly memorable customers. Some would head home to modest apartments, others to shared quarters provided by the bathhouse owners. A few would stop at nearby taverns for a drink and a meal sleep through before trying to the daylight hours. All of them would be back the next evening, ready to transform another group of stressed, lonely, or simply lustful Romans into relaxed, satisfied customers. The bathhouses represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Rome's night economy. They required significant capital investment, skilled labor, and careful management to operate successfully. They attracted a wealthier clientele and provided higher quality services than most other establishments. But they also demanded more from the women who worked there, requiring them to be part performer, part therapist, part business manager. Yet even in this more upscale environment, the fundamental dynamics remained the same. Women with limited options used their intelligence, their bodies, and their emotional skills to carve out spaces for themselves in a world designed to exclude them. They formed communities of mutual support, developed strategies for survival and success, and occasionally managed to transcend their circumstances entirely. As we prepare to leave the steamy, intimate world of the bathhouses and continue our journey through the Roman night, we're beginning to see the full complexity of this hidden economy. It wasn't just about sex, though sex was certainly central to it. It was about human connection, economic survival, social mobility, and the endless human capacity to find dignity and meaning, even in the most challenging circumstances. But we've only seen two facets of this multifaceted world. The night is still young by Roman standards, and there are more establishments to visit, more women to meet, more stories to uncover. The brothels await, from the grand lupanars that served the wealthy to the tiny cubicles where the desperate served the destitute. Each had its own rules, its own culture, its own tragic and triumphant stories. The Roman night economy was vast and varied, encompassing everything from street walking to high-class escort services. We're about to enter its heart, the places where pretense was stripped away along with clothing, where the transactions were explicit and the relationships, paradoxically, sometimes more honest than those found in respectable society. The brothels of Rome weren't hidden away in dark corners where shame could fester and secrets could rot. They stood brazenly on busy streets, their doorways marked with stone phalluses carved into the pavement like ancient neon signs pointing the way to pleasure. If you were walking through the Subura, Rome's most notorious district, you couldn't miss them. And frankly, you weren't supposed to. The word lupanarium, from which we get our term for these establishments, comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf. But this wasn't just poetic license. Roman mythology held that Rome itself was founded by twins suckled by a wolf, and the connection wasn't accidental. These women were seen as wild, dangerous, necessary creatures who existed at the margins of civilization, yet somehow sustained it. Step through the doorway of a typical Roman brothel, and you'd find yourself in a world that operated by its own brutal logic. The ground floor was usually divided into small cells, each barely large enough for a narrow stone bed covered with a thin mattress. These weren't rooms designed for comfort or romance. They were functional spaces built for efficiency, durability, and the rapid turnover of customers. Above each doorway, painted in vivid colors that have somehow survived 2,000 years under volcanic ash, were explicit frescoes showing exactly what services were available inside. These weren't artistic flourishes or decoration. They were menus, practical advertisements for customers who might not speak Latin or couldn't read. Point to the image you wanted, pay your coins, and conduct your business. But here's where our modern assumptions about ancient brothels start to crumble. These weren't necessarily places of unrelieved misery and exploitation. Yes, many of the women working there were slaves with no choice in their circumstances, but others were freed women who chose this work because it offered better pay than weaving cloth or carrying water. Some were foreign women who spoke multiple languages and commanded premium prices for their exotic appeal. The hierarchy within the brothels was as complex as Roman society itself. At the bottom were the newly enslaved women, often war captives or girls sold by desperate families who worked the ground floor cells for the lowest prices. These women served everyone from common labourers to drunken soldiers, charging prices that barely covered their keep. Their lives were harsh, their futures uncertain, their dignity constantly under assault. But climb the stairs to the upper floors, and you'd find a different world entirely. Here were the women who had learned to work the system, who had developed regular clienteles, who could afford to be selective about their customers. They had larger rooms, better furnishings, and the luxury of charging higher prices. Some even had personal slaves of their own, creating their own miniature hierarchies within the broader structure of exploitation. The most successful brothel workers understood that they were selling more than just physical services. They were providing fantasy, companionship, and emotional release to men who couldn't find these things in their respectable lives. A Roman man might have a wife chosen for him by his family, a marriage based on political alliance or economic advantage, rather than attraction or compatibility. Where could he go to experience passion, to feel desired, to explore aspects of his sexuality that proper society wouldn't permit? The answer was the brothels, but not in the way you might expect. The women who thrived in this environment weren't passive victims waiting for rescue. They were active participants in elaborate psychological dramas, skilled performers who understood their customers' needs, sometimes better than the men understood them themselves. Take Scylla, whose name appears dozens of times in Pompeii graffiti. Scylla doesn't just satisfy your body, reads one wall. She reads your soul. Another inscription, more revealing. I told Scylla things I've never told my wife. She listened. These weren't just commercial endorsements. They were testimonials to emotional services that proper Roman society didn't acknowledge but desperately needed. The daily rhythm of brothel life followed patterns that would be recognizable to anyone who's ever worked night shifts. The women would wake in the late afternoon, often sharing cramped quarters above or behind the establishment. They'd prepare for the evening ahead, helping each other with makeup made from lead and antimony, arranging their hair in styles that would attract customers, and sharing information about which clients to avoid. The preparation wasn't just cosmetic. These women had to be psychologically ready for whatever the night might bring. They developed their own rituals for protection, both physical and spiritual. Some carried small amulets depicting Priapus, the god of fertility and protection. Others whispered prayers to Venus, or made offerings to household gods who might watch over women far from home and family. As evening approached and the first customers began arriving, the brothels would come alive with activity. The women would position themselves strategically, some lounging in doorways to attract street traffic, others positioning themselves where they could catch the eye of men climbing the stairs to the upper floors. Competition was fierce, but it wasn't always cutthroat. Experienced women often helped newcomers learn the ropes, sharing techniques for managing difficult customers and maximizing earnings. The customers themselves were as varied as Rome's population. Young men celebrating military victories or mourning defeats would arrive in groups, their inhibitions dissolved in wine and their purses heavy with spoils or loans. Married merchants would slip away from business dinners, claiming urgent appointments while their colleagues winked knowingly. Senators would arrive in disguise, their togas replaced with common tunics, their dignified bearing abandoned for the night. Each type of customer required different handling. The young soldiers needed to feel brave and powerful. The lonely merchants craved attention and admiration. The disguised senators wanted to shed their public personas and experience genuine human connection, even if only for a few minutes. The most successful brothel workers became expert at reading these needs and providing exactly what each man was seeking. The pricing structure reflected these different markets. A quick encounter with a ground floor worker might cost as little as 2 asses, about the price of a cup of wine. But an hour with one of the upper floor specialists could cost a gold aureus, enough money to feed a family for a month. The women who could command these premium prices had usually spent years building their reputations, developing specialized skills, and cultivating networks of wealthy regular customers. But money wasn't the only currency in the brothels. Information was equally valuable, and the women who worked there were perfectly positioned to gather it. Customers would arrive stressed about business deals, worried about political developments, or excited about military campaigns. In the intimate aftermath of their encounters, inhibitions lowered by wine and pleasure, they would share secrets that could be worth fortunes to the right buyers. Some brothel workers became informal intelligence agents, selling information to political factions, business rivals, or anyone willing to pay for insider knowledge. A casual comment about troop movements might be worth more than a night's regular earnings. A senator's confession about his voting intentions could influence major policy decisions. The pillow talk of the powerful became a commodity as valuable as sex itself. The relationships between the women themselves were complex and often contradictory. Competition for the best customers could create bitter rivalries, but shared dangers also fostered fierce loyalties. Women would warn each other about violent customers, share medicine for occupational hazards, and pool resources to help colleagues in desperate situations. Some developed partnerships that went beyond mere business convenience. Older women would mentor younger ones, teaching them not just sexual techniques, but survival skills. How to spot a customer who might turn violent. Which magistrates could be bribed to ignore complaints. How to save money and perhaps eventually buy freedom or start a different kind of business. The legal framework surrounding brothel work was typically Roman in its complexity and contradictions. Prostitution was legal, regulated, and taxed, but prostitutes themselves were classified as infames, people without legal honor who couldn't testify in court, make wills, or contract legal marriages with citizens. This created a paradoxical situation where the state profited from their work while denying them basic protections. Local magistrates were supposed to oversee the brothels, ensuring fair treatment and collecting taxes. In practice, this oversight often amounted to corruption and extortion. Officials would demand bribes to overlook violations, impose arbitrary fines when they needed quick revenue, or use their authority to obtain free services. The women had little recourse against such abuse, creating an environment where exploitation was systemic rather than exceptional. Yet within these constraints, some women managed to accumulate significant wealth and influence. They would invest their earnings in other businesses, purchase property through intermediaries, or even buy their own freedom if they were enslaved. A few exceptional women became wealthy enough to sponsor gladiatorial games or donate to public works projects, though they had to be careful not to attract too much attention or jealousy. The most successful brothel entrepreneurs understood that they were running sophisticated service businesses. They had to manage inventory, maintain facilities, recruit and train workers, handle marketing and customer relations, and navigate complex regulatory environments. Some developed chains of establishments, each catering to different market segments. Others specialized in particular services or customer types. The physical environment of the brothels was designed to maximize both efficiency and atmosphere. The ground floor cells were small and basic, but they were also private and secure. The stone beds were practical rather than comfortable, but they were also easy to clean and maintain. The explicit artwork wasn't just advertising, but also served to create an atmosphere where normal social inhibitions could be temporarily suspended. The upper floors of the better establishments could be quite luxurious by ancient standards. Larger rooms with wooden beds, oil lamps that provided better lighting, and even simple decorations that created a more intimate atmosphere. Some rooms had small alcoves where customers could wash before and after their encounters, a service that commanded additional fees, but also helped establish the establishment's reputation for cleanliness. The women who worked in these better environments had usually earned their positions through a combination of beauty, skill, and business acumen. They understood that their success depended not just on their physical attributes, but on their ability to make customers feel special, desired, and understood. They developed personas that were part fantasy, part reality, always carefully calibrated to appeal to their target market. As the night progressed and the wine flowed freely throughout the city, the brothels would experience waves of customers corresponding to the closing times of taverns, the end of dinner parties, and the conclusion of theatre performances. Each wave brought different challenges and opportunities. The early evening customers were usually sober and quick about their business. The late-night crowd was often drunk, unpredictable, and either very generous or very difficult. The women learned to adapt their approaches to these rhythms. They might be brisk and efficient with the early customers, saving rative late-night trade. They developed their energy for the more Luke D techniques for managing intoxicated customers, knowing when to be indulgent and when to be firm. The most experienced workers could sense trouble before it started and had strategies for diffusing dangerous situations. But trouble was always a possibility. Customers might become violent, refuse to pay, or make unreasonable demands. Rival establishments might send troublemakers to disrupt business. Local gangs might demand protection money or attempt to recruit women for other illegal activities. The brothel owners employed security staff, but these men couldn't be everywhere at once, and their protection came at a price. The women developed their own methods of mutual protection. They would work in pairs when possible, watching out for each other's safety. They created coded signals to summon help when needed. They shared information about dangerous customers and developed strategies for avoiding or managing difficult situations. In a world where the law offered them little protection, they had to protect themselves. As dawn approached and the last customers stumbled home to their respectable lives, the brothels would begin their own closing rituals. The women would count their earnings, tend to any injuries or health issues, and prepare for a few hours of rest before the cycle began again. Some would share a meal together, discussing the night's events and planning for the future. Others would retreat to solitary rooms, exhausted by the emotional and physical demands of their work. The brothels never truly slept. There were always chambers to be cleaned, supplies to be restocked, and preparations to be made for the next evening. The women who worked there lived in a parallel world that operated alongside respectable Roman society, but followed its own rules, created its own hierarchies, and sustained its own communities. But the brothels were just one part of Rome's vast night economy. At the very top of this world were women who transcended the traditional boundaries of sex work entirely, who became powers in their own right, who wielded influence that extended far beyond the bedchamber. These were the courtesans, the educated, sophisticated, impossibly expensive companions who moved in the higher circles of Roman society. Their stories reveal the ultimate possibilities and limitations of female agency in the ancient world, and they're about to show us what happened when intelligence, beauty, and ambition combined in ways that could reshape the very foundations of empire. But at the pinnacle of Rome's night economy stood women who defied every category, every assumption, every limitation that Roman society tried to impose on their gender. These were the courtesans. And they weren't just selling their bodies. They were selling their minds, their wit, their cultural sophistication, and their ability to move seamlessly between worlds that were supposed to remain forever separate. Forget everything you think you know about high-class prostitution. The Roman courtesan was an entirely different creature, a woman who had somehow managed to transform the oldest profession into something approaching an art form. These weren't desperate women selling themselves for survival. Thesuals and power were entrepreneurs, intellect brokers who happened to use sexuality as one tool among many in their sophisticated arsenal. Picture Clodia, though that probably wasn't her real name. Real names were luxuries that courtesans rarely indulged in, preferring carefully crafted personas that could be adjusted depending on the client and the situation. Clodia spoke 4 languages fluently, could recite Homer from memory, played the lyre with professional that reached into the highest levels of Roman government skill, and maintained a network of contacts. Oh, and she charged more for a single evening than most Romans earned in a year. Her villa on the Palatine Hill rivaled those of senators in its luxury and sophistication. The atrium was decorated with original Greek sculptures. The dining room featured frescoes by the most celebrated artists of the day, and the library contained scrolls that were the envy of scholars throughout the empire. When clients visited Clodia, they weren't just purchasing sexual services. They were entering a world of refined culture and intellectual stimulation that many couldn't find anywhere else in Rome. The transformation from ordinary sex worker to courtesan wasn't something that happened overnight. It required years of careful planning, substantial financial investment, and an almost superhuman level of self-discipline and intelligence. A woman might start in the brothels or taverns, but if she was exceptionally beautiful, unusually clever, or remarkably lucky, she might catch the attention of someone willing to invest in her education and refinement. This patron, often a wealthy merchant or minor senator, would arrange for her training in music, poetry, rhetoric, and the social graces that distinguish the elite from the masses. She would learn to read and write in Latin and Greek, to discuss philosophy and politics with authority, to move gracefully through formal dinner parties, and to converse intelligently on topics ranging from military strategy to agricultural techniques. But this education came at a price that went far beyond money. The woman had to completely reinvent herself, abandoning her original identity and creating a new persona that could command respect and enormous fees from Rome's most powerful men. She had to learn to suppress any traces of her humble origins, to speak with the accent of the educated classes, and to carry herself with the confidence of someone born to privilege. The financial arrangements between courtesans and their clients were as complex as any business deal. A single evening might cost anywhere from 50 to 500 gold aurei, depending on the woman's reputation and the services requested. But the truly successful courtesans weren't interested in one-night transactions. They cultivated long-term relationships with wealthy patrons who would support them for months or even years at a time. These arrangements resembled marriage in many ways, except that they were explicitly temporary, and the woman maintained her independence. A courtesan might live in a house provided by her patron, receive a generous monthly allowance, and accompany him to social events as his unofficial consort. In return, she would provide not just sexual services, but also intellectual companionship, social prestige, and emotional support. The most successful courtesans often had multiple patrons simultaneously, carefully managing their schedules to avoid conflicts while maximizing their income. This required extraordinary organizational skills and an almost diplomatic level of tact. A courtesan might spend Monday evenings with a wealthy merchant discussing trade routes over imported wine, Tuesday afternoons with a senator debating policy while strolling through private gardens, and Wednesday nights with a general planning military campaigns. Between intimate encounters. But the real power of the courtesans lay not in their beauty or even their intelligence, but in their unique position as bridges between different worlds. They moved freely between the respectable society of their patrons and the underground economy of the streets. They could obtain information that was impossible to get through official channels, influence decisions that were supposedly made in secret, and broker deals between parties who couldn't officially acknowledge each other's existence. Some courtesans became informal diplomats, carrying messages between rival political factions or negotiating truces in business disputes. Their neutrality was protected by their status as outsiders to the formal power structure, and their discretion was guaranteed by their need to maintain their reputations. A courtesan who betrayed confidences would quickly find herself without clients, but one who could be trusted with sensitive information might powerful men in Rome. The intelligence find herself indispensable to the most networks that some courtesans developed, rivaled those of official government agencies. They would collect information from their various clients, cross-reference it with gossip from other courtesans, and piece together comprehensive pictures of political and economic developments that weren't yet public knowledge. This information could then be sold to interested parties or used to make profitable investments in their own names. Consider Volumnia, whose influence became so extensive that senators would consult her before making major policy decisions. She maintained detailed files on the personal lives, business interests, and political ambitions of dozens of powerful Romans. When a new consul was elected, she knew about his gambling debts. When a general was appointed to command a campaign, she knew about his wife's affairs. When a wealthy merchant was planning a major trade expedition, she knew about his financial backing. This knowledge wasn't gathered through espionage in the traditional sense, but through careful attention to the casual comments, emotional revelations, and unguarded moments that occurred during intimate encounters. Ad about a risky investment might discuss senator celebrating a political victory, might reveal his strategy for the next campaign. A merchant worry his concerns with the one person who seemed genuinely interested in his problems. A general missing his wife might describe military plans while seeking emotional comfort. The courtesans understood that information was power, but they also understood that power had to be exercised carefully. They couldn't directly challenge the political establishment without risking everything they had built. Instead, they worked through influence and suggestion, shaping decisions without appearing to make them, guiding policies without officially participating in their formation. Some courtesans used their influence to protect other women in the sex trade. They would warn their former colleagues about dangerous clients, provide financial support during difficult times, or use their connections to help talented women make the transition to more respectable work. This wasn't just altruism, but also practical politics. A courtesan, who was seen as protective of other women, could count on their loyalty and support when she needed it. The houses where courtesans entertained their clients were stages carefully designed to reinforce their elevated status. Every detail was calculated to impress and intimidate. The entrance hall featured expensive artwork that demonstrated cultural sophistication. The dining room was equipped with the finest furniture and dinnerware that money could buy. The bedchamber was appointed with silks and perfumes that created an atmosphere of luxury and sensuality. But perhaps most importantly, these houses served as neutral ground where men who were political rivals or business competitors could meet. Informed dinner party might include senators, courtesans from opposing factions, merchants who competed for the same contracts, or generals who commanded rival legions. The hostess would carefully manage the conversation to avoid conflicts while encouraging the kind of informal negotiations that couldn't take place in public forums. The social events hosted by successful courtesans became legendary in Roman high society. These weren't just dinner parties, but carefully orchestrated performances where politics, business, and pleasure intersected in ways that were impossible elsewhere. Guests would arrive knowing that they might encounter anyone from tax collectors to provincial governors, and that any conversation might lead to profitable opportunities or dangerous entanglements. The courtesans themselves served as both participants and directors of these events. They would guide conversations toward topics that might benefit their guests, introduce people who could help each other, and deflect discussions that might become heated or dangerous. Their success depended on their ability to make everyone feel that they were getting something valuable from the evening, whether it was information, connections, or simply the pleasure of sophisticated company. The education that successful courtesans received was far superior to what was available to most Roman women, even those from wealthy families. While respectable matrons were expected to focus on household management and child-rearing, courtesans studied rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and literature. They learned to debate complex issues, to analyze political developments, and to understand the economic forces that shaped the empire. This education wasn't just for show. Courtesans needed to be able to hold their own in conversations with the most intelligent and educated men in Rome. They had to understand military tactics well enough to discuss campaigns with generals, comprehend legal principles sufficiently to converse with magistrates, and grasp economic theory adequately to advise merchants on their business ventures. Some courtesans became genuine intellectuals in their own right, writing poetry that was circulated in literary circles, developing philosophical theories that influenced scholarly debates, or making mathematical discoveries that advanced human knowledge. A few even established schools where they taught younger women the skills necessary for success in their profession, creating educational institutions that existed nowhere else in Roman society. But the intellectual achievements of courtesans were always constrained by their social status. They couldn't publish their writings under their own names, couldn't participate officially in philosophical debates, and couldn't receive credit for their discoveries. Their contributions to Roman intellectual life had to be channeled through male intermediaries who could present their ideas to respectable society. The physical beauty that was essential to a courtesan's success required constant maintenance and substantial financial investment. They employed teams of slaves who specialized in cosmetics, hairdressing, and clothing. They imported the finest perfumes from distant provinces, commissioned custom jewelry from master craftsmen, and maintained wardrobes that rivaled those of emperors' wives. But beauty alone wasn't sufficient for long-term success. As courtesans aged, they had to rely increasingly on their intelligence, connections, and accumulated wealth to maintain their positions. The smartest ones began preparing for retirement while they were still young, investing their earnings in property, businesses, and financial instruments that would provide income when their physical attractions faded. Some successful courtesans used their wealth to become patrons themselves, supporting younger women who showed promise, funding artistic projects, or even establishing charitable foundations. They understood that their influence depended on their ability to help others, and they used their resources strategically to build networks of loyalty and obligation that could protect them in their old age. The relationships between courtesans and their clients often evolved in unexpected directions. What began as purely commercial arrangements could develop into genuine affection, mutual respect, or even something approaching love. Some clients would continue supporting former courtesans long after their physical relationships had ended, maintaining friendships that lasted for decades. These emotional connections created both opportunities and vulnerabilities. A courtesan who had genuinely won a client's affection might find herself protected from enemies and provided for in old age. But she might also find herself trapped in a relationship that had become stifling or dangerous, unable to end it without losing financial security and social protection. The most successful courtesans learned to navigate these emotional complexities with the same skill they applied to political and business relationships. They understood how to maintain their independence while providing the emotional support their clients needed. They knew when to reveal genuine feelings and when to maintain professional distance. They mastered the art of making each client feel special while protecting their own emotional well-being. But even the most successful courtesans lived with constant uncertainty. Their positions depended entirely on their ability to please powerful men, whose moods, interests, and circumstances could change without warning. A client's death, a shift in political fortunes, or simply the natural effects of aging could destroy a career that had taken decades to build. This precariousness created a unique form of solidarity among successful courtesans. They would share information about clients' preferences and financial situations, warn each other about dangerous or unreliable patrons, and sometimes even collaborate on major projects that required multiple women's skills and connections. Competition existed, but it was tempered by the recognition that they all faced similar challenges and vulnerabilities. The legacy of Roman courtesans extended far beyond their individual lifespans. They established precedents for female independence and influence that would inspire women for centuries to come. They demonstrated that intelligence and determination could overcome even the most restrictive social circumstances. They showed that women could wield real power in supposedly male-dominated societies, even if they had to do so indirectly and unofficially. Their influence on Roman culture was profound and lasting. They shaped fashion, promoted artistic innovation, and facilitated the exchange of ideas between different social classes and ethnic groups. They served as patrons of poets, philosophers, and artists who might not have found support elsewhere. They created spaces where intellectual and cultural development could flourish outside the constraints of official institutions. But perhaps most importantly, they preserved and transmitted knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The libraries they maintained, the conversations they fostered, and the networks they created helped ensure that Roman intellectual achievements survived political upheavals and social transformations. They were, in their own way, guardians of civilization who used their unique positions to protect and nurture the cultural heritage of their time. As we reach the end of our journey through the Roman night, we're left with a picture that's far more complex and nuanced than the simple stories of exploitation and degradation that usually dominate discussions of ancient prostitution. Yes, there was exploitation. Yes, there was suffering. Yes, there were women who had no choices, and men who took advantage of their desperation. But there were also women who carved out spaces of agency and dignity in impossible circumstances. There were relationships that transcended commercial transactions to become genuine human connections. There were communities of mutual support that sustained women through the darkest moments of their lives. And there were individuals who used whatever tools they had available to build lives of meaning, influence, and even luxury. The Roman night economy reveals truths about human nature that are as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. It shows us how people adapt to harsh circumstances, how they form communities in unlikely places, and how they find ways to assert their humanity even when society tries to deny it. It reminds us that history isn't just about the powerful and privileged, but about ordinary people living extraordinary lives in the margins of empire. As dawn breaks over the 7 hills and the last oil lamps flicker out in the taverns and brothels of Rome, we're left with voices that refuse to be silenced, stories that demand to be told, and lives that remind us that dignity and courage can flourish even in the shadows of history. The Roman night may be over, but its lessons echo through the centuries, whispering truths about power, survival, and the endless human capacity for resilience. The women of the Roman night weren't just footnotes in the story of empire. They were active participants in the creation of one of history's greatest civilizations, and their contributions deserve to be remembered alongside those of senators and generals, poets and philosophers. They lived, they loved, they struggled, and they endured. And in doing so, they left us a legacy that's far richer and more complex than the marble monuments that bear the names of emperors. As the sun finally crested the hills and painted the Roman streets in pale gold, the transformation was as dramatic as any staged in the great theatres of the empire. The women who had ruled the night began their own exodus from the spotlight. But this wasn't simply a matter of closing shop and going home. The end of the Roman night was as carefully choreographed as its beginning, a complex dance of survival, planning, and preparation for the next evening's performance. The tavern women were often the last to leave their posts. As the final customers stumbled out into the dawn light, clutching their heads and their empty purses, The kopie would begin the slow process of cleaning up from the night's chaos. Wine had to be mopped from floors, broken pottery swept away, and tables scrubbed clean of the evidence of Rome's nocturnal appetites. But more importantly, this was when the real business of the night was conducted. Money had to be counted, divided, and hidden. The successful tavern women had learned hard lessons about keeping their earnings safe from thieves, corrupt officials, and even their own employers. Some had developed elaborate systems of hiding places, spreading their coins among multiple locations to minimize losses if discovered. Others had formed partnerships with trusted money changers who would convert their earnings into more portable forms of wealth. The information gathered during the night's work was equally valuable and required careful handling. A casual comment from a drunken senator about upcoming legislation could be worth more than a month's regular earnings to the right buyer. But selling information was dangerous business that required connections, discretion, and perfect timing. The women who succeeded at this game had to be part economist, part spy, and part fortune teller. Meanwhile, in the bathhouses, the attendants faced their own dawn rituals. The warm waters that had provided such intimate settings for the night's encounters now had to be drained, cleaned, and refilled for the respectable day clientele. Evidence of nocturnal activities had to be carefully removed while maintaining the fiction that nothing untoward had ever occurred in these temples to cleanliness. The women themselves underwent their own transformations. Makeup had to be washed away, revealing faces that were often younger and more vulnerable than their nighttime personas suggested. Hair that had been carefully arranged to attract customers was now pulled back into simple styles, suitable for daylight invisibility. The elaborate costumes of the night were replaced with plain tunics that would help them blend into the crowds of ordinary Romans, beginning their daily routines. But the bathhouse attendants faced unique challenges that their tavern counterparts didn't have to consider. The intimate nature of their work left them particularly vulnerable to emotional complications. Regular customers often developed feelings that went beyond mere commercial interest, and managing these relationships required extraordinary psychological skill. A woman might have to gently discourage a client's romantic fantasies while maintaining his financial support and protecting his dignity. Some attendants developed almost therapeutic relationships with their regular customers. Roman men, constrained by rigid social expectations and limited emotional outlets, often found in these women the only people to whom they could reveal their fears, doubts, and vulnerabilities. The attendants who recognized and cultivated this need could build incredibly lucrative long-term relationships that provided financial security and even a form of social protection. The brothels presented their own complex closing procedures. The ground floor workers, exhausted from serving an endless stream of customers, would collapse onto their narrow stone beds for a few hours of rest before the cycle began again. But even sleep was a luxury that had to be carefully managed. Dangerous customers might return, rival establishments might send troublemakers, or local authorities might conduct surprise inspections. The women who worked the upper floors of the better establishments had more control over their schedules and could afford to be more selective about when and how they rested. Some maintained small apartments away from their workplaces, creating private spaces where they could temporarily escape the demands of their profession. Others invested in personal security, hiring former gladiators or retired soldiers to protect them during their most vulnerable hours. The hierarchy that governed brothel life during the night continued into the daylight hours, but with subtle shifts that reflected the different challenges of surviving in Roman society. The most successful women used their accumulated wealth and influence to begin investing in their futures. Some purchased small businesses that could provide income when their physical attractions faded. Others bought property that they could rent to other women in similar circumstances. A few exceptional women managed to transcend their origins entirely, using their accumulated wealth and connections to enter respectable society through carefully arranged marriages or adoptions. But this transition required extraordinary skill, luck, and timing. A former prostitute who attracted too much attention or moved too quickly could find herself exposed and humiliated, losing everything she had worked to build. The courtesans faced the most complex dawn transitions of all. Their elevated status came with correspondingly elevated expectations and responsibilities. They couldn't simply disappear into anonymous crowds, but had to maintain their carefully constructed personas even during daylight hours. Their homes had to be ready to receive unexpected visitors, their appearances had to remain flawless, and their knowledge of current events had to stay current. Many courtesans used their daylight hours for activities that would have astonished the ordinary Romans, who saw only their nighttime glamour. They studied literature and philosophy with private tutors, practiced musical instruments with professional musicians, and corresponded with scholars and intellectuals throughout the empire. Their education was ongoing, requiring constant investment of time and money to maintain the intellectual sophistication that set them apart from ordinary sex workers. The financial management required of successful courtesans rivaled that of major merchants or landowners. They had to track income from multiple sources, manage complex investment portfolios, and maintain careful records of their various business relationships. Some employed entire staffs of accountants, scribes, and legal advisors to help manage their affairs. But perhaps most demanding of all was the emotional labor required to maintain relationships with powerful men who were accustomed to getting whatever they wanted. A courtesan's success depended on her ability to make each client feel unique and valued while maintaining enough emotional distance to protect her own psychological well-being. This balancing act required constant vigilance and extraordinary self-discipline. The networks of mutual support that sustained the women of the Roman night became even more important during the daylight hours. Information flowed freely between different levels of the sex trade, creating an informal intelligence network that could warn of dangers, identify opportunities, or provide assistance during emergencies. A tavern woman might tip off a courtesan about a dangerous client, while a bathhouse attendant might share news of a wealthy merchant looking for a new companion. These relationships weren't just practical, but often genuinely affectionate. Women who had endured similar hardships and navigated similar challenges formed bonds that transcended their different circumstances. They celebrated each other's successes, mourned each other's losses, and provided emotional support that was often unavailable anywhere else in Roman society. The daily routines of these women were shaped by the constant need to prepare for the next night's work, while managing the consequences of the previous night's activities. Health problems were a constant concern, both from occupational hazards and from the general stresses of their lifestyle. Roman medicine offered limited solutions for many of these issues, forcing the women to develop their own remedies and support systems. Mental health was equally important, but even less well understood. The psychological toll of their work could be devastating, particularly for women who had been forced into the trade against their will. Those who survived and thrived developed remarkable resilience and coping strategies, but the cost was often invisibility to history. The women who broke down under the pressure rarely left records of their experiences. The successful women used their daylight hours to build alternative identities that could provide security and respectability. Some became patrons of religious cults that offered community and spiritual comfort. Others invested in charitable activities that could earn them social recognition and divine favor. A few even managed to establish lasting relationships with men who accepted their pasts and offered genuine partnership. But the shadow of their night work was never far away. Roman society's complex attitudes towards sexuality meant that these women existed in a perpetual state of moral ambiguity. They were simultaneously necessary and condemned, valued and despised, powerful and powerless. This contradiction shaped every aspect of their lives and limited their options even when they had accumulated considerable wealth and influence. The younger women in the trade spent their daylight hours learning from their more experienced colleagues. This education went far beyond sexual techniques to include survival skills, financial management, and social navigation. The most successful older women often took personal interest in promising newcomers, seeing in them both potential allies and reminders of their own younger selves. The training was comprehensive and practical. New women had to learn how to read customers' moods and intentions, how to maximize earnings while minimizing risks, and how to build the kind of regular clientele that provided financial stability. They also had to understand the complex web of laws, customs, and unwritten rules that governed their profession. But perhaps most importantly, they had to learn how to maintain their humanity in circumstances that constantly threatened to dehumanize them. This meant developing internal resources of strength, dignity, and self-worth that couldn't be taken away by customers, employers, or society at large. The women who mastered this internal work often became leaders and mentors within their communities. The physical maintenance required for success in the night economy was extensive and expensive. Cosmetics had to be purchased and applied with skill, clothing had to be cleaned and repaired, and personal hygiene had to be maintained despite limited access to clean water and proper facilities. The women who could afford it employed personal slaves to help with these tasks, but many had to manage everything themselves. Diet and exercise were equally important but often neglected due to the irregular schedules and limited resources that characterized their lives. The most successful women understood that their bodies were their primary business assets and invested accordingly in their health and appearance. This might include hiring personal physicians, purchasing expensive imported foods, or even taking time away from work to recover from illness or injury. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life affected the night economy in complex ways. Winter brought different challenges than summer, with heating costs, reduced foot traffic, and increased competition for wealthy customers who might prefer to stay home by their fires. Spring and summer brought their own problems, including increased disease transmission, higher food costs, and the migration patterns of wealthy Romans who might spend months at their country estates. The women had to adapt their strategies to these changing conditions while maintaining the income levels necessary for survival. This required careful planning, financial discipline, and often considerable creativity. Some formed seasonal partnerships, periods. Others developed alternative sharing resources and customers during difficult income sources that could sustain them when their primary work was less profitable. The religious lives of these women were often overlooked by historians, but were crucial to their psychological survival. Many were devoted followers of various gods and goddesses who offered protection, comfort, or hope for a better future. Venus was naturally popular among sex workers, but so were deities associated with healing, fortune, and foreign lands. Some women formed their own religious communities, creating spaces where they could worship without judgment or interference. These groups often served multiple functions, providing spiritual comfort, social support, and practical assistance to members in need. They were among the few institutions in Roman society that offered these women dignity and respect. The festival calendar provided both opportunities and challenges for the night economy. Religious celebrations often brought increased business as visitors flocked to the city, but they also brought increased scrutiny from authorities concerned with maintaining public order. The women had to navigate these periods carefully, maximizing their earnings while avoiding the attention of officials who might be looking for scapegoats if celebrations got out of hand. Some festivals were particularly significant for sex workers. The Floralia, dedicated to the goddess of flowers and spring, was traditionally associated with sexual license and provided legitimate opportunities for women to display themselves publicly. The Saturnalia temporarily reversed social hierarchies, creating unique opportunities for women to interact with customers who might normally be beyond their reach. But these festivals also reminded the women of their exclusion from respectable society. While other Romans celebrated openly with their families and communities, sex workers often found themselves serving the same people who would ignore or condemn them in other contexts. This contradiction was a constant reminder of their ambiguous position in Roman society. The aging process presented particular challenges for women in the night economy. Unlike men, whose value often increased with age and experience, women faced declining earning potential as their physical attractions faded. The successful ones planned for this inevitability from the beginning of their careers, but many were caught unprepared and faced destitution in their later years. Some older women transitioned into management roles, using their experience and connections to run establishments rather than work in them directly. Others became trainers and mentors, passing on their knowledge to younger to accumulate enough wealth to retire comfortably. But this women, while earning income from their expertise. A few manage. The most tragic figures was the exception rather than the rule. Women who had been successful in their youth but failed to plan for their futures. Roman society offered few safety nets for aging sex workers, and many ended their lives in poverty, an indice of the precarious nature of successed obscurity. Their stories serve as rare mutual support networks that these women create in this world, and the importance of their own unique challenges in Roman society. Sonst. The children of sex workers' face might be accepted more readily than daughters, but all carried the stigma of their mothers' professions. Some women went to extraordinary lengths to hide their work from their children, creating elaborate deceptions that became increasingly difficult to maintain as the children aged. Others were more open about their circumstances, teaching their children to navigate the complexities of their situation with dignity and intelligence. These children often developed remarkable resilience and social skills, learning to move between different worlds with ease. Some eventually achieved social mobility that would have been impossible for their mothers. The most successful women often used their resources to provide their children with opportunities that might break the cycle of marginalization. They hired tutors, arranged apprenticeships, or even purchased citizenship rights when possible. These investments represented hope for the future and a form of immortality that transcended their own circumstances. The documentation of these women's lives creates its own fascinating historical puzzle. Roman record-keeping was extensive, but it focused primarily on the concerns of male citizens. The voices of sex workers appear in graffiti, legal documents, and literary works, but always filtered through the perspectives and prejudices of others. Occasionally, we catch glimpses of their authentic voices in personal letters, tomb inscriptions, or business documents. These fragments are precious because they reveal the women as they saw themselves rather than as others saw them. They speak of love and loss, hope and disappointment, pride and shame, reminding us that these were complete human beings rather than historical curiosities. The archaeological evidence from sites like Pompeii provides another window into their world. The physical spaces where they lived and worked, the objects they used daily, and the images that decorated their environments all tell stories that supplement the written record. This material evidence often reveals details that literary sources ignore or romanticize. But perhaps the most important evidence is the sheer persistence of these women in the historical record. Despite efforts to marginalize or erase them, their stories survived because they were integral to Roman society. They couldn't be completely ignored because they served functions that respectable society needed but couldn't officially acknowledge. The legacy of Roman sex workers extends far beyond their individual stories to influence our understanding of gender, sexuality, and agency in the ancient world. They challenge simplistic narratives about female powerlessness and male domination by revealing the complex ways that marginalized women could accumulate influence and shape their circumstances. Their entrepreneurial activities, cultural contributions, and social innovations demonstrate that even the most restricted members of society could find ways to assert their humanity and create meaningful lives. They remind us that history is not just about the powerful and privileged, but about ordinary people making extraordinary efforts to survive and thrive in difficult circumstances. The economic impact of the Roman night economy was substantial and lasting. The wealth generated by this industry supported not just the women themselves, but entire networks of suppliers, service providers, and related businesses. The tax revenues helped fund public works and military campaigns. The information networks facilitated trade and diplomacy throughout the empire. But perhaps most importantly, these women created spaces where Roman society could explore aspects of human experience that were otherwise suppressed or ignored. They provided emotional outlets, intellectual stimulation, and social connections that helped sustain the psychological health of the empire's male population. Their work was therapeutic as much as commercial, addressing needs that no other Roman institution was equipped to meet. The cultural influence of these women is visible in Roman art, literature, and popular culture. They appear in poetry, plays, and novels not just as objects of desire, but as complex characters with their own motivations and agency. They influenced fashion, spread new ideas, and served as bridges between different social classes and ethnic groups. Their impact on Roman law was also significant, though often indirect. Legal disputes involving sex workers forced Roman jurists to grapple with questions about personal autonomy, commercial relationships, and the rights of marginalized people. The legal precedents established in these cases influenced Roman jurisprudence for centuries and eventually contributed to the development of concepts that we now associate with human rights and personal dignity. As our journey through the Roman night reaches its end, we're left with a profound appreciation for the complexity and humanity of these often overlooked historical figures. They were not just victims of patriarchal oppression or examples of ancient moral corruption. They were real people who faced impossible circumstances with courage, creativity, and determination. Their stories remind us that human dignity is not something that can be granted or taken away by social institutions, but something that emerges from within individuals who refuse to accept the limitations that others try to impose on them. They teach us about resilience, community, and the endless human capacity to find meaning and connection even in the darkest circumstances. The Roman night may have ended 2,000 years ago, but the lessons it teaches about survival, adaptation, and the pursuit of dignity in the face of adversity remain as relevant today as they were in the ancient world. These women carved out spaces for themselves in the margins of empire, and in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to inspire and inform our understanding of what it means to be human. Their voices, preserved in fragments of graffiti, scattered legal documents, and the occasional literary reference, still speak to us across the centuries. They tell us that history belongs not just to the emperors and senators, whose names grace our textbooks, but to the countless ordinary people who lived, loved, struggled, and endured in circumstances that would have defeated lesser spirits. The sun has risen over the 7 hills, the oil lamps have been extinguished, and the women of the Roman night have faded back into the shadows of history. But their stories live on, reminding us that even in the most constrained circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to assert its dignity, create community, and leave marks on the world that time cannot completely erase. As we close this chapter of our exploration into the hidden corners of ancient history, we carry with us not just knowledge about the past, but insights into the enduring human experiences of survival, adaptation, and the search for meaning in an often hostile world. The Roman night economy was more than just a historical curiosity. It was a laboratory for human ingenuity, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder that dignity and agency can flourish even in the most unlikely places. The women who survived and thrived in Rome's night economy didn't just disappear when their working days ended. They evolved, adapted, and often transformed themselves in ways that would have seemed impossible when they first entered this shadowy world. Their later years reveal perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire story: the remarkable ability of human beings to reinvent themselves even after society has written them off. Picture Livia, though that wasn't the name she was born with, or even the name she used during her years working the taverns of the Subura. By the time she reached 40, an age when most Roman women were considered past their prime, she had accumulated enough wealth and connections to purchase a small vineyard outside the city walls. Her wine, produced with techniques learned from conversations with dozens of merchants over countless nights, became renowned for its quality and found its way to the tables of senators who had no idea they were drinking vintage produced by a former barmaid. But Livia's transformation went deeper than mere economic success. She had become a different person entirely, one who moved through respectable society with the confidence that comes from having survived experiences that would have broken weaker souls. She sponsored gladiatorial games, donated to temple renovations, and even served as an informal marriage broker for families seeking advantageous alliances. Her past wasn't erased. It was transformed into a source of strength and wisdom that few respectable matrons could match. The process of reinvention wasn't simple or guaranteed. It required careful planning, substantial resources, and an almost supernatural ability to read social situations and adapt accordingly. The women who succeeded understood that they weren't just changing their occupations. They were rewriting their entire identities from the ground up. Some chose to disappear entirely, moving to distant provinces where their histories were unknown and their wealth could buy them entry into local aristocracies. They would arrive as mysterious widows with tragic pasts, their stories carefully crafted to explain their independence while concealing their true origins. These women often became pillars of their new communities, their hard-won wisdom channeled into charitable works and social leadership. Others remained in Rome, but used their accumulated influence to carve out new roles for themselves within the existing social structure. They became patrons of the arts, sponsors of religious festivals, or informal advisors to powerful men who valued their unique perspectives on human nature and social dynamics. Their brothel-learned skills at reading people and managing complex relationships proved invaluable in these new contexts. The most successful reinventions often involved some form of mentorship or education. Former courtesans established schools where young women could learn not just reading and writing, but the subtle arts of conversation, negotiation, and social navigation that were rarely taught elsewhere. These institutions operated in legal grey areas, offering services that respectable society needed but couldn't officially acknowledge. Consider the transformation of women like Claudia Maxima, whose tomb inscription in a fashionable cemetery outside Rome reads like that of any wealthy matron. It speaks of her charitable donations, her patronage of poets, and her devotion to the goddess Isis. Only the most careful observer would notice the subtle clues that hint at her unconventional past, the emphasis on self-made wealth, the absence of family connections, the particular deities she chose to honor, but not every story ended in successful reinvention. The women who failed to adapt often faced brutal declines that were all the more tragic for having briefly tasted success and independence. Age, illness, or simply bad luck could destroy years of careful planning and accumulated wealth. These women might end their days in the same poverty they had worked so desperately to escape, their brief period of influence remembered only in fading graffiti on crumbling walls. The children and grandchildren of these women faced their own unique challenges and opportunities. Some carried the stigma of their family histories throughout their lives, never quite able to escape whispers about their grandmother's occupations. But others used their inherited wealth and their family's hard-won wisdom to achieve social positions that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. These second and third generation descendants often became some of Rome's most successful entrepreneurs, their family backgrounds having taught them skills that pampered aristocrats never learned. They understood money in ways that old families didn't, having watched their mothers count coins by lamplight and plan for futures that were never guaranteed. They knew how to read people, having grown up around women who had made careers out of understanding human nature in all its complexity. The religious lives of these women in their later years were often particularly rich and meaningful. Many became devoted followers of mystery cults that promised transformation and redemption, finding in these secretive religious communities the acceptance and dignity that had been denied them in mainstream society. The cult of Isis was especially popular among former sex workers, perhaps because the goddess herself was associated with magic, transformation, and the protection of marginalized women. Some established their own religious foundations, creating temples and festivals that served both as expressions of personal devotion and as ways of giving back to the communities that had sustained them during their most difficult years. These religious activities provided not just spiritual comfort, but also social legitimacy, allowing former sex workers to take on respected roles as priestesses and religious leaders. The business acumen that these women had developed during their working years often found new expression in their later activities. They became moneylenders, property developers, and investors, using their accumulated capital and their understanding of human nature to build substantial fortunes. Some established what were essentially early forms of banks, lending money to other women seeking to escape poverty or start their own businesses. Their investment strategies were often remarkably sophisticated, diversified across multiple sectors and geographic regions in ways that would have impressed modern portfolio managers. They understood risk better than most Romans, having lived with uncertainty as a constant companion, and they were skilled at finding opportunities that others overlooked. The networks of mutual support that had sustained these women during their working years often evolved into something resembling early forms of insurance companies or social welfare organizations. Groups of former sex workers would pool their resources to provide support for aging colleagues, fund medical care for those who couldn't afford it, and provide burial expenses for women who died without family to care for them. These organizations operated quietly but effectively, creating safety nets that filled gaps left by official Roman institutions. They were among the first examples of voluntary associations, organized and run entirely by women, providing models for later feminist organizing that historians are only beginning to appreciate. The cultural impact of these women in their later years was often more profound than their influence during their working days. Free from the daily pressures of survival, they could invest time and energy in artistic and intellectual pursuits that had been impossible earlier in their lives. Some became patrons of poets and philosophers, using their wealth to support creative work that might not have found funding elsewhere. Others became artists and writers themselves, finally having the leisure and resources to develop talents that had been suppressed by the demands of their former occupations. Their work was often marked by an emotional depth and psychological insight that reflected their unique life experiences, though they usually had to publish under assumed names or through male intermediaries. The political influence that some of these women wielded in their later years was exercised quietly but effectively. They couldn't hold official positions or vote in elections, but they could and did influence policy through their relationships with powerful men who valued their advice and insights. Their understanding of human nature, honed through years of managing difficult customers and navigating dangerous situations, made them formidable behind-the-scenes political operators. Some became informal diplomats, using their connections and their reputations for discretion to facilitate negotiations between rival factions or competing business interests. Their neutrality was protected by their outsider status, and their effectiveness was enhanced by their ability to understand and manipulate the motivations of the men they dealt with. The educational initiatives that many of these women supported or established represented perhaps their most lasting contribution to Roman society. They understood better than most the transformative power of knowledge and the importance of providing opportunities for other women to escape the circumstances that had once trapped them. These educational programs were often remarkably progressive, teaching not just basic literacy and numeracy, but also critical thinking, business skills, and social navigation techniques. They were among the first institutions in Roman society, to treat women's intellectual development as valuable in its own right, rather than merely as preparation for marriage and motherhood. The legal innovations that emerged from the activities of these women in their later years had lasting impacts on Roman jurisprudence. Their business dealings, property transactions, and charitable foundations forced Roman lawyers and judges to grapple with questions about women's rights and capabilities that had previously been largely theoretical. The legal precedents established through their activities gradually expanded the rights of all Roman women, creating new possibilities for female economic participation and social influence that extended far beyond the sex trade. Their success in accumulating and managing wealth demonstrated that women were capable of the kind of rational economic behavior that Roman law had traditionally assumed was exclusively male. The medical knowledge that many of these women had accumulated during their working years often found new applications in their later activities. They became informal physicians and healers, using their understanding of human anatomy and their experience with various health issues to provide medical care that was often superior to what was available from official practitioners. Some established what were essentially early forms of hospitals or clinics, providing medical care specifically for women and focusing on health issues that male physicians often ignored or misunderstood. Their approach to medicine was often more holistic and compassionate than the mechanical treatments favoured by their male counterparts. The technological innovations that some of these women supported or developed were often related to their business activities, but had broader applications for Roman society. They invested in improved manufacturing techniques, better transportation methods, and more efficient agricultural practices, using their accumulated wealth to fund research and development that might not have been profitable in the short term, but had significant long-term benefits. Their understanding of supply and demand, developed through years of managing their own services as commodities, made them particularly effective at identifying market opportunities and inefficiencies that others missed. They were among Rome's most successful entrepreneurs, though their achievements were often attributed to male business partners or advisors. The international connections that many of these women had developed during their working years became valuable assets in their later business and social activities. They maintained correspondence with contacts throughout the empire, creating information networks that rivaled those of official government agencies in their scope and reliability. These networks facilitated trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange in ways that official channels couldn't match. The women who managed them became informal ambassadors and cultural brokers, helping to spread Roman influence while also bringing foreign innovations and ideas back to the capital. The architectural projects that some of these women sponsored or commissioned reflected their unique perspectives on urban planning and social organization. Having lived and worked in the cramped, dangerous spaces that characterize much of Roman nightlife, they understood better than most the importance of creating environments that were both functional and humane. Their building projects often included innovative features designed to improve safety, comfort, and efficiency for the people who would use them. They were among the first Romans to seriously consider the needs of women and lower-class citizens in architectural planning, creating spaces that served broader social purposes than mere display of wealth and status. The literary works that some of these women produced or sponsored offered unique perspectives on Roman society that were rarely found in more conventional sources. Their writings often focused on the experiences of marginalized people, the realities of urban life, and the complex relationships between different social classes. These works provided valuable historical records of aspects of Roman life that official sources often ignored or sanitized. They offer modern historians insights into daily life, social relationships, and cultural practices that would otherwise be lost to history. The agricultural innovations that many of these women supported reflected their practical understanding of resource management and their commitment to improving the lives of ordinary people. They invested in improved farming techniques, better crop varieties, and more efficient food distribution systems, Their agricultural estates often served as experimental stations where new techniques were tested and refined before being adopted more broadly. Their success in agriculture demonstrated that intensive management and investment in innovation could dramatically improve productivity, providing models that were eventually adopted throughout the empire. The Roman night wasn't just about fleeting encounters in shadowy corners or quick transactions in smoky taverns. It was an entire parallel civilization that operated alongside the marble monuments and grand speeches we usually associate with ancient Rome. A world where women with no official power carved out spaces of influence, where outcasts built communities of mutual support, and where human connection flourished in the most unlikely circumstances. These weren't just stories of exploitation and desperation. Though those elements were certainly present, they were stories of resilience, ingenuity, and the endless human capacity to find dignity even when the world tries to strip it away. The tavern women who turned conversation into currency, the bath attendants who provided emotional healing alongside physical pleasure, the brothel workers who protected each other in a dangerous world, and the courtesans who wielded influence that extended into the highest levels of government. All of them remind us that history belongs not just to the emperors and senators, but to the ordinary people who refuse to remain invisible. The next time you walk through the ruins of Pompeii or read about the grandeur of the Roman Empire, remember that behind every marble column and golden statue were real people living complex, difficult, extraordinary lives. The women of the Roman night may have worked in the shadows, but their legacy illuminates truths about survival, community, and human dignity that shine just as brightly as any monument to imperial power. They didn't just serve the empire. In their own way, they helped build it, one whispered secret and one act of courage at a time.